Hello. So I didn't talk much about the Reading attack at the time because I didn't want to just sort of make a video stating the basics at the time because I think it would have been already well covered as indeed it was. There was also other things going on, but there is some things that need to be said about this, or at least asked. Sounds almost like a rather nauseating cliche to say lessons need to be learned, um, because it's the same thing said after every attack. But let's look at the absolute basics of this situation. It has been called a terrorist attack. Three men were killed and three others were seriously wounded, which makes it the worst terrorist attack in Britain since the Fishmonger's Hall attack in London last year. Um, in that case, three people died, but one of them was a terrorist. So this is also notable in that it's occurred in a provincial town as opposed to the capital. Most terrorist attacks in Britain are in London, so that's that's notable. Um, and a few different things are emerging from this. The three men who died were part of the LGBT community. One of the victims, James Furlong, was described as a history teacher who loved his students, who is a much loved son, um, and he was described as inspiring. So I'm going to read out a little bit from the eye as to the suspect, who is a Libyan national by the name of Khairi Sadala. Incidentally, there's also a Libyan involved in the Manchester bombing. So this report is by Kim Sin Gupta, and I'm not going to read out the whole thing, but I'll read out a few paragraphs here. The Libyan man arrested in connection with the multiple stabbings in Reading. This was in the Forbury Gardens public park in the centre of Reading. The three people dead had sought to travel abroad to take part in jihad, according to security sources. The suspect, a 25-year-old Libyan asylum seeker called Khairi Sadala, came to the attention of security and intelligence agencies in 2019 when he was seeking to join an Islamist group in the Middle East. Mr. Sadala was put under surveillance, but the investigation was scaled down when the journey did not take place. He was subsequently jailed after being convicted of a minor crime. Doesn't say what that minor crime is. Police say they are looking at information provided by dozens of callers, including witnesses to the multiple stabbings. One lead, according to a Whitehall official, concerns Manchester, but it is unclear at present whether this will have any significance. Mr. Sadala is believed to have arrived in the UK several years ago and had claimed that his family had suffered in the violence which began in Libya after the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime in 2011. Extremist Islamist groups have carried out attacks in Libya as well as neighbouring Tunisia, but it is not known at present whether he had any connection with any of the groups. Um, and it hasn't been mentioned in the attack itself if, for example, he screamed Allahu Akbar, which is a common theme of Islamist attacks. Um, it's known that this guy had mental health issues, and I don't say that lightly. This is what has been reported. Apparently, he had a mental health caseworker. One of the people involved who were, uh, I don't know if he was a witness, but he knew Sadala, said that he'd smoked pot with the guy and he never expressed extremist views. Um, there has been some studies showing that marijuana usage can lead to schizophrenia. Whether there's anything in that, I don't know. Um, but the information that is available seems to suggest that Sadala did have a violent record. And I'm reading now from the Metro newspaper, where it says Sadala, who had been freed from jail on probation, applied for asylum after arriving in 2012 as a tourist. This is arriving in the UK. He has done time for a series of violent offences and went on trial last year over an attack with a broken bottle on a Sainsbury's security guard, Sidney McDonald, 65, who also witnessed Saturday's arrest. Um, so this wasn't a case of just a suspect who kind of was being watched. He actually had a violent record. Now, the obvious question there is he's a foreign national. It doesn't state that he got British citizenship. So why was he not deported after that violent offence? That's a glaringly obvious question. Um, by contrast, because often in these cases, there's a lot of focus on the suspect, the perpetrator, and I think should be. I don't think you could totally ignore that. I know some governments take this approach of let's not name the perpetrator and let's not give them propaganda, but I don't think you can avoid talking about the perpetrator and the ideology behind the perpetrator, whether it be Islamist or far right. Um, so this guy's 25. He fled Libya. The Manchester bomber was also a Libyan. I think there's a lot of things to raise with this. The Boris Johnson has said if there's lessons to be learned, then they need to be learned. Well, clearly there was lessons to be learned after the Fishmongers Hall attack last year. Um, there are some things about the circumstances of this attack that raised questions. Earlier in the day, there had been a Black Lives Matter rally event at Forbury Gardens. Now, a lot of people have been quick to say that's got no connection. I'm sure he has no allegiance to Black Lives Matter. There's no indication that he does. However, given the sort of racial sentiments that are obviously raised at Black Lives Matter events, is it really that much of a coincidence? Now, I have to stress there's no hard evidence for this. It's purely speculation. But when you are having rhetoric about white privilege and about the racist, terrible society that we're in, is it really far-fetched to say that this could have, um, for want of a better term, triggered Sadala? I mean, is it really just a coincidence? I don't know. Maybe it is. Another significant thing in this is that the three men targeted were all gay. So could this be a homophobic hate crime? Is there anything in the attack, for example, did he shout out any homophobic slurs? Witnesses said that he had a knife and he went frenetically stabbing people. So it might just be a coincidence that the three fatalities happened to be gay men. But if there's any indication that he was motivated by the fact they were gay, that would certainly put credence to the Islamist motivation. Now, the fact is, it has been called a terrorist attack. So the obvious question is, there's a reason for that. And I think it's because this guy had been monitored by the security services for showing his interest in Islamist activity in North Africa, but he didn't go ahead with it, right? So, when these things happen, it always gets into a debate about what is terrorism and what isn't every time. I mean, there's been many incidents in this country in recent years whereby witnesses have said that the perpetrator has shouted Allahu Akbar, but it's not formally classed as a terrorist incident. Yet other cases like this one are. So the question is why? And at what point do you differentiate between, I mean, I imagine in the prosecution of this guy, the extent of his mental health problems is going to have to be taken into consideration as to culpability. Um, certainly he needs to be locked up for the rest of his life. He's clearly a dangerous individual. Um, there's a lot of points that need to be raised. If people are coming from war zones, and this doesn't just apply to terrorism, incidentally, I think it also applies to London's gang culture. Many of the gangs in London are Somalis and others from countries ravaged by civil war in Africa, and they're bringing. Often they grow up as youngsters. It's with the sort of horrors that are seen in those countries, the sort of desensitization to human life. Um, so clearly, more needs to be done in terms of, adapting refugees to our society. Um, and there should be no political correctness around that. Integration, it is once again a reminder of the importance of integration. Um, but I'm of the opinion that if someone commits a violent offence in this country, they need to be deported. It is unfathomable that someone who is a foreign national can commit a violent offence. This guy had used a glass bottle against a security guard. That's a violent offence. How they can stay in the country. Britain has given him refuge, and that's how he shows gratitude by committing violent offences and now a terrorist attack. It's going to anger a lot of people. Um, and what's the result? A young teacher, James Furlong, who was described as an inspiration, enjoying a summer afternoon with his friends, um, brutally murdered. You um, I mean, people might say there's other attacks involving spree stabbings. In this country, spree stabbings more than if it was America, it would be spree shootings. Um, the thing about terrorism is there has to be a political motivation, right? So the reason we don't class gang warfare as terrorism is because that tends to be between rival gangs over turf, right? It doesn't usually have some sort of Islamist or socialist or neo-Nazi inspiration. It tends to just be, drug rivalry and battles over turf. In this case, if there's any indication whatsoever that this guy had been, for example, visiting jihadist websites, if he'd been influenced by that, that's obviously the motivation as to why it's a terrorist attack and why it was designated as such. What's interesting is usually the police are fairly quick to call these things terrorist attacks, if indeed they are. Now, nationalists will often say, oh, they're being politically correct if it's not called a terrorist attack. But wording does matter. So let's say, for example, this was a spree stabbing and three men died. That would still be an atrocity. But if he hadn't been monitored for Islamist activity, if he'd been a gang member, then technically it wouldn't be a terrorist attack. It would still be an atrocity, but it wouldn't technically be a terrorist attack unless it was motivated by a hate crime, for example, targeting these three men because they were gay. Um, it's not good enough to say lessons need to be learned because this is the line every single time. Here's the problem. There are literally probably hundreds, if not thousands, of people on MI5 GCHQ's watch list. Um, the practicalities of arresting all of them and throwing them in jail is obviously difficult. So clearly, very, very clearly, we need much, much, much stronger vetting of who is coming into this country. And that should not be, the left needs to wake up on this. They need to stop being politically correct and stop interpreting that as racist. If people are coming from war zones, inevitably they're going to need to adapt to our society. And that isn't just in terms of coming into a society that is politically stable, relatively speaking, and peaceful. It's also about Western values. So, for example, if there's any information that this guy targeted these men for being gay, and like I say, there's no hard evidence for that right now, but if there's any indication of that, that would indicate that you're getting Muslim refugees who are coming in with extreme homophobic viewpoints, could be also extreme misogynistic viewpoints or extreme anti-Semitic viewpoints. All those things need to be seriously looked at. Um, so it really isn't enough to say lessons need to be learned because people will say, well, yeah, until next time. I actually think that we're going to see a lot of attacks like this. I think we're going to see less attacks on the scale of the London bombings 15 years ago, where you had a large scale bombing on a transit system with mass casualties, 52 people killed along with the four terrorists, and I think it was 800 wounded. So that's a large, large scale attack. The Manchester bombing, 22 killed, and again, hundreds wounded. Those sort of attacks are going to be mercifully rare. Smaller scale attacks where you may have perhaps several fatalities and several wounded, I think sadly are going to be commonplace. We're in a kind of Cold War situation with this. And it may be that these individuals are lone wolves, but that doesn't mean that they're not capable of obviously extreme acts. Um, so this isn't going to be the last such attack. It would be a miracle if there's not more attacks like this in coming years, even months. And I think there's no easy answer, but definitely we need much stricter vetting. And if that is about people coming from countries where there are high rates of Islamist extremism, high, countries that are unstable, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan, countries which clearly will have drastically different values to our own, there must be vetting. Um, I appreciate, I mean, I'm reluctant to be too hard on the security services because every day there isn't an attack is a day that they have got it right. They're working around the clock, and there's that old adage that terrorists only have to get it right once, whereas, they need to get it right all the time. I think what we're seeing with Islamist terrorism is a little bit like the IRA campaign in London and the rest of Great Britain from 1973 to 2001. There was a large number of mostly small scale attacks. Some of them were deadly, some of them resulted in injuries. Not many of them caused mass casualties, as in many dead, but nevertheless they were deadly and they caused significant disruption to life. I think we're going to see that with Islamist terrorism. Um, so I think it's not good enough to just say lessons need to be learned. As soon as a foreign national commits a crime in this country, especially if they are coming from war zones, especially if they are exhibiting values that are contradicting our values on egalitarianism, for example, and freedom of expression, then I think there needs to be a process for making it far easier to deport them. Um, and the Libyans might say, "Oh, we don't want them," right? But he's your national, so he's your problem. Um, and this is an area where, with the human rights question, say for example, you get someone who's in the UK, and human rights lawyers will say, "Oh, but if he's sent back, he will be tortured." Well, you know what? There's also the human rights of British citizens to live in safety. That needs to be considered as well. There's no easy answers to this, but clearly something needs to change. Clearly, we need much stricter vetting. Clearly, all of those who are being monitored. Now, I appreciate it's not easy because you might have someone who hasn't technically, went to the extent of making a bomb or going to a war zone, to join ISIS or something like that. But this case shows that even those who are supposedly not obviously Islamist could still be potentially dangerous. Now, whether this attack is a result of his drug use, i.e., it's affected his mind or something, I don't know. What I'd like to know is, did he shout anything out during this attack? That's significant because if he made homophobic slurs, if he made La Allah Akbars, chants, I haven't seen any information suggesting he shouted anything out. Clearly, there's going to need to be scrutiny as to what extent his mental health problems made him culpable for his own actions. But this is going to happen again, and my thoughts are entirely with the three men who were killed, their families, and also the three injured. Um, Clearly, we need to change the situation. There needs to be stricter vetting. There also needs to be vetting of even British nationals who are displaying extremist tendencies. And by the way, that also includes converts. Some of the most extreme, intolerant views I've seen from Islamists have come from Western, British born converts. They're not refugees. They're not always, people coming from other countries. Some of the most extreme Islamist views are British nationals, British Muslims. And to those regressives who want to say it's Islamophobia, wake up. Just wake up, because this is a reality.